Looking at the live register trends over the last 12 months, I mean, here we see that in the state there's been an 87.1% increase in the number of people signing on. Limerick, a 91.3% increase, which is one of the worst performing regions or areas in the country, but still not significantly worse than most other parts of the country. So Limerick is doing okay, there is no doubt about that, and I think it's important to recognise that reality. Looking at employment by sector, I mean, the key message, and this is a vulnerability I identified 12 months ago in relation to Limerick and the Midwest, and I think it's a vulnerability that has really come to pass in the last 12 months, and that is the fact that the region had a very high dependency on construction, agriculture and manufacturing. And with the exception of agriculture, which is starting to have a little bit of a mini revival at the moment, construction and manufacturing are clearly two sectors that in this country are under serious pressure, you know, as evidenced by the Dell situation here in Limerick. There's a lower level of financial and business services than in other parts of the country. The one thing you would say, okay, well, the Midwest is dependent, and Limerick dependent on regions that are, dependent on sectors that are under pressure. At least the planned construction activity, and I'll talk about it in a second, for Limerick over the next 4 or 5 years should ensure that construction activity remains reasonably vibrant. But as an economy, we cannot and should not depend on construction for everything. It's part of the process, it's not the whole process. There just needs to be a very heavy focus on high-level employment creation in the Limerick region. And this applies to the whole country. It's not just Limerick. It's the quality of what we do. It's the quality of the jobs we create that is a hell of a lot more important than the quantity of growth or the quantity of jobs we create. I think we lost our way a lot over the last 6 or 7 years. We started to believe our own publicity. We were creating lots of jobs, but if you look down at the quality of a lot of the jobs we were creating, they just were not sustainable, because it was inevitable that at some point we'd have pumped enough concrete into the ground. And it was also inevitable, and there is a certain inevitability about the loss of manufacturing jobs around the country as manufacturers move to cheaper locations around the world. That is an inevitability about economic development. You can influence it, but it's very hard to change it. Looking at the population change, you know, Limerick doing okay, particularly if you take account of the boundary situation. Looking at average house prices, I suppose what I'm saying here really is that, you know, Limerick has a lot of stuff going for it that should be marketed. For one, it's a cheap housing location. Some people would regard that as a negative economic indicator, but I would regard it as a positive, because if you are trying to attract people into a region to live and to work, it's the quality, the availability and the affordability of housing that is extremely important. Limerick stacks up extremely well in that regard. So there is a vision out there for Limerick City that, you know, having spent a few months down here doing an in-depth study, it came across very strongly to me. It's a city that is in the middle, well, I suppose at the beginnings of a major regeneration programme that will hopefully transform the face of the city. There's lots of vision out there, and I just outlined people like EML, the Atlantic Way, the Limerick Docklands Initiative, Murray O'Leary Architect, and there are many more besides out there. There's a lot of people in Limerick who have a very ambitious vision for what Limerick needs to do as a city and as an economy. The public initiative's very positive. We've Transport 21, we have the city centre strategy, we have the regeneration project, which is, in an Irish context, an unprecedented economic and social plan that hopefully will come to successful fruition. There are lots of private sector initiatives, plans such as the Opera Centre, the Arthur's Quay development, and if all of those plans come on stream, they certainly will utterly transform the face of Limerick City. And it's happening. You can see it. I certainly see it every time I come into the city. What is Limerick going for it? And I think you need to be positive about these factors and build on these factors. It has close proximity to an international airport, which is extremely important. It has a high quality educational offering, which is extremely important. It has an affordable housing market. It has a strong offering in the arts and culture areas. It has a city council that certainly struck me, and I'm sure people may have differing views on this, but certainly in my interaction with the city council, I got the very strong message: this is a city council that is open for business. Transport 21 is opening up the city. The regeneration project, the Shannon Development Agency, there's a very strong private and public sector commitment to developing Limerick as a city. And I think very importantly, in the context of where we are this morning, Limerick has a very strong sporting offering, and it currently boasts the second best hurling coach in the country that Waterford unfortunately kicked out. But I think this whole sporting thing is extremely important, and you know, Anthony mentioned the role of UL in terms of sport as a business, and I think that is extremely important. What needs to be done? Well, obviously, as I've outlined, there is a heavy dependence on sectors that are under pressure, so there needs to be a proactive employment policy. We need to sort out the governance structure in the city. You know, it struck me as extremely strange that you had 3 local authorities basically vying for the same space, and that militated against the sort of joined up thinking that any city needs. You need to ensure that the regeneration project avoids potential pitfalls. The official vision of the city that is out there, it needs to be shared by all stakeholders, and you know, we need to ensure that that vision actually materialises. And there is, of course, the image of Limerick, which in the media hasn't been portrayed as particularly positive in recent years. You know, it's up to every stakeholder in this city, in this region, to get out there and proclaim the very positive messages. Well, and I think this is extremely important. You know, it's very difficult for a region to lift itself out of a recessionary situation in the absence of a national recovery. So I focus in here on the conditions for recovery at a national level. Well, obviously, there's stuff that needs to happen. We need to see a recovery in the international economic cycle. I believe we're going to start to see that coming through the end of this year into 2010, and by 2011, the global economic cycle should be back on a stronger growth footing. We need to see the stabilisation of the housing market. And just to put that in context, 2006 we built 93,000 houses. Next year we're likely to build around 15,000 as a country. So that's the big story of the Irish economy, is this collapse in housing activity. 15,000 next year will represent the bottom of the cycle, and thereafter there's going to be a gradual pick-up in house building. But we are not going back to the insanity that prevailed in 2006, and we should not want to go back there. We need to see a solution to the banking crisis, because at the end of the day, regardless of what we think of banks and bankers, credit and the role which banks play in facilitating credit creation in the economy is the lifeblood of economic activity, and it is one of the biggest issues, particularly for small businesses out there. It's access to credit. That situation needs to be sorted as quickly as possible, and Peter Bacon is making some very sensible suggestions to government about that at the moment. We need to see the sterling situation getting a little bit better. We need to see fiscal certainty. In other words, next April 7th needs to put an end to all this speculation about tax increases and about spending cutbacks. In my view, and I think this is extremely important, I know of no example in the world where an economy managed to tax its way out of recession. I know plenty of examples where economies taxed themselves into a worse recession. The burden of adjustment in the public finances has to come on the public spending side rather than on the taxation side. And thankfully, there is a very sane, very bright Limerick man now advising Brian Lenihan. And I believe Alan Ahern, I believe these are the messages that he is giving Brian Lenihan at the moment, that he needs to be very careful about not increasing the tax burden too much, because that could certainly make a recession worse. So we do need to see a little bit more fiscal certainty, and I suppose most important of all, as an economy, we quite simply have got to become more competitive.